Good evening, everybody, and welcome to CCHS's first virtual lecture. So I'm really pleased to have Dr. Jessica Sheets here. Just a quick introduction. My name is Dr. Lindsay Varner. I'm the Community Outreach Director here at Cumberland County Historical Society. And a few ground rules for this evening. Please keep yourself muted and keep your video off just to help Dr. Sheets as she goes through her presentation. And also, if you have any questions for her, please type them into the comments portion of Zoom. At the end of her presentation, I will read those to her and she will answer your questions. So as you think of them during the presentation, just go ahead and type them in. I'll be keeping track of all of them. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Sheets. She is a research historian at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. She graduated from Penn State in May 2020 with a PhD in American Studies. Her dissertation, the subject of her talk tonight, is titled No More Striving Brother Against Brother, Family Divisions and Historical Memory of the Revolutionary War. She has presented her dissertation research at Fort Ticonderoga, the Society for Military History, and more. Jessica volunteered monthly at Cumberland County Historical Society from 2006 until she started her PhD in 2013. She published in the Historical Society's journal, Cumberland County History, in 2012 on Carlisle native and Revolutionary War veteran, Major James Armstrong Wilson, and his house is still standing. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Sheets.
Good evening. Thank you to the Cumberland County Historical Society for inviting me to speak here. And thank you to family, friends, and others who have joined and are watching this live or are watching this as a recorded version. It is good to be here. As mentioned, I volunteered here in my pre-PhD days when I had some more free time, and I greatly enjoyed that experience. As noted, my dissertation focused on families that were politically divided by the Revolutionary War. Tonight, I will be highlighting one particular family, the Chillmans of Maryland. I got to know them very well by reading over 300 of their letters and documents, and they are one of 3 families that I examined for my dissertation. Since they had such a wealth of materials, I just did the bulk of my research on them. So stay tuned to learn if their disagreements led to a permanent family split or if they managed to overcome their differences. And I know there are those of you out there who know the end of this story because you put up with me talking about my dissertation or you followed my Facebook posts as I conducted research. So please no spoilers in the comments on Zoom. After detailing the Tillman story, I will briefly discuss a split family from South Carolina just to show that the Tillmans were certainly not an anomaly. And then I will discuss why accounts of such divisiveness in the Revolutionary War tend not to be common knowledge today. On October 24, 1781, a flyer distributed in Philadelphia proclaimed the surrender of General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown. The flyer read, Colonel Tillman, aide-de-camp to His Excellency General Washington, having brought official accounts of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and the garrisons of York and Gloucester. Those citizens who choose to illuminate on the glorious occasion will do it this evening at 6 and extinguish their lights at 9 o'clock. Who was that Colonel Tillman selected by General Washington with the honor of delivering such joyous news to the Continental Congress? Lieutenant Colonel Tench Chillman of Maryland was Washington's longest serving aide, by his side for about 6 years, beginning in August of 1776. With that kind of position and dedication, one would think Tench came from a steadfast patriot family. He did not. As Tench traveled by boat and horseback over the course of 4 days from Yorktown to Philadelphia, and I drove a small portion of that exact route, hence the picture you see, he surely thought of what this news would mean to his loyalist father James, who had been arrested, and his loyalist brothers, Richard, William, and Philemon. Tench's mother had died in 1771 and thus did not live to see her family disagree over the war, but his sisters did, and they wrote about it. Perhaps on his ride north, Tench also thought of his father's brother Matthew, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress and would come to be known as the father of the Revolution in Maryland. Politics certainly complicated this family tree. And you don't need to memorize this slide. I'm going to be showing it multiple times to help keep everybody straight. Tench was born in 1744, and he was the oldest child of James and Anne Frances Tillman of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. 5 brothers and 4 sisters followed. James practiced law in Maryland. Around 1763, he moved his family to Philadelphia because of his wife's health. In 1765, he was appointed Secretary of the Pennsylvania Land Office by John Penn. James was in that position at the start of the Revolutionary War. In 1776, Tench volunteered to serve as an aide to General Washington. James was understandably distraught at Tench's choice. In an August 76 letter, James put his feelings on paper. Dear Tench, I am glad to hear you are well, but I cannot reconcile myself to your situation. I don't mean you're being in the general service, as I think it preferable to any other where you are, but I mean you're being engaged in a cause which does not coincide with your judgment, the support of independence, which sooner or later will, in my opinion, complete the ruin of America. James then tried to convince Tench to get into business during the war rather than military service. He closed with these lines: "Whatever part you take, I hope and trust will act it in a becoming manner. God direct, bless, and prosper you. I am your affectionate father, James Tillman." James added beneath his signature, "While I was writing, the enclosed from your brother came to hand, which I broke open. The note read, 'While you're at New York, I shall be glad to hear from you now and then such things as you may communicate consistent with your duty and engagements to General Washington. Nothing else would I wish to hear from you. Letters may miscarry, or I may unguardedly mention what ought to be concealed. Therefore, don't trust me with any such thing.'" It is unclear which brother wrote that letter, but clearly he wanted to stay in touch. Tench would be the only patriot brother among this family, but that was not offensive to this brother at this point. Tench responded directly to a particular portion of James's letter to him. "When you say, 'Bear with me this once, and I will say no more on the subject,' you seem to hint as if you thought that your advice would be disagreeable or set hard upon me. But indeed you are mistaken. I know it proceeds from your regard to me and from no other motive." Tench knew and respected his father well enough not to react rashly to what he knew his father would be concerned for him. That same month, August of 1776, Richard, almost exactly 2 years younger than Tench, sailed for England, intent on service with the East India Company. James noted in a letter that Richard, induced by the wretched prospect of affairs here and a better in the East Indies, he is on his way thither. A letter from Richard to his father in December 76 appears to include a reaction to Tench's decision to serve with Washington. I must confess the letter contained a particular matter which both astonished and grieved me. You will easily guess what I mean. It is what you yourself mentioned with concern. In circumstances, however, like the present, it is a consolation to think that those who differ from us act upon principle, and we know that the person I speak of can be influenced by none but the most honorable motives. Working for a British company, Richard would not want it widely known that he had a brother serving with General Washington. In the spring of 77, Richard sailed from England to Calcutta, and upon his arrival, he was admitted as a barrister to the Supreme Court of Bengal. Tench and James wrote faithfully during the war, letters replete with observations on the latest developments. Tench wrote to his father on December 27, 76, after the Battle of Trenton, to let him know that he was safe and well after a most successful enterprise. Tench then gave him a detailed account of what happened. In another letter, 2 days later, Tench declared to his father, "We are just going over to Jersey again in pursuit of the remainder of the Hessian army who have left Bordentown. The general waits while I write this much. My most affectionate love to my sisters." How ironic that as Washington waited, Tench told his loyalist father the intent of the Continental Army. In a February 77 letter to his father, Tench closed with, "I know we do not agree in political sentiments quite, but that I am convinced does not in the least abate that ardent affection which I have for you, which makes me happy, far happier than any other title, when I call myself your most dutiful son." Tench was a trusted aide to the highest commander of the Continental Army, yet he was happiest when called James's son. James wrote from Philadelphia 2 months later, in February 77, to one of his brothers, likely Matthew. They corresponded despite their political differences. "General Washington, in my opinion, and that of many others here, as not a force sufficient to face Howe in a general engagement. How must James have felt, believing that his son was serving with a general who could not do well in a battle against British General William Howe? Tench's sisters retained their affection for him during the war, despite his being the only patriot man in their immediate family. Tench wrote to his sisters, and when writing to his father, he talked often about his sisters and mentioned his love for them. Henrietta Maria, 13, wrote to her father in late 76 that, hearing from you and brother Tench, is the only pleasure we now enjoy. In a March 77 letter to her father, Anna Maria, aged 27, wrote, I was made happy by the appearance of a letter from my brother Tench, but when I came to open it, it almost broke my heart. He talks of never seeing us again, and says if he should fall, it will be in such a way and in such a cause that we shall never blush when we hear his name mentioned. He says he has no need to make a will, but desires if any accident should happen to him, that Betsy, Molly, and myself would accept of the things which he imported in happier days as a small token of his affection for us. God grant that he may live to enjoy them himself. I shall ever regret his differing from sentiment from you on such an important occasion as the present dispute. Tench learned of his sister's reaction to his letter and wrote to mend things. I am sorry that my sister should have so seriously taken to heart any expressions in my last letter. I never meant any such thing. By their mode of reasoning, a man should never make his will. I will write to them the first leisure hour and set all to rights again. Tench, by this time 32 years old, responded quickly and thoughtfully, learning to break in his sister's heart. In an April 77 letter to his father from Washington's headquarters in Morristown, Tench accepted not agreeing with his father on politics. I late last night received yours of the 21st. The contents really made me exceedingly unhappy, as I find myself unable to agree with you in sentiment upon the present measures. He mentioned intending to see his father when circumstances allowed, and then continued on with more of their differences. I will say nothing upon the score of politics, because it is a subject that ought not at this time to be discussed upon paper. I wish it might be dropped in all future letters between us, because they probably fall into hands other than mine. I know your sentiments proceed from a conviction that the present measures are wrong, and therefore hurtful to the country, to the welfare of which I am sure you are a sincere good wisher. But all will not make the same allowance. Rather than cut off communication with his father in anger over their disagreement, Tench simply requested that they not talk of politics. During the summer of 77, James and other proprietary officials, including Governor John Penn, were arrested for not signing an oath announcing the king and in support of Pennsylvania. Though James had disapproved of the 1765 Stamp Act, he never supported independence. James thought the terms of his parole unfair, but he signed the document. One of James's other sons, Phil, ran away to the Royal Navy, angry over his father's arrest. He was 16. James and even Tench and others tried to get Phil to return home. James feared that Phil would not have enough money and would not be able to advance in the Navy because he had no connections. Also, family credit was at stake. Phil had made a rash decision and was at risk of tarnishing the family name. James wanted his son to behave with honor. However, Phil would not budge. He had joined Howe's fleet on the Delaware River, and Howe had made him a midshipman. Tench was consumed with supporting Washington, but wrote to his father of his political stance and living situation in a letter of late May 1778, just about 2 weeks before the British left Philadelphia. Tench wrote, after noting he had received multiple letters from his father, I cannot say they give me pleasure, because at the time of writing them you seem to have been under very great uneasiness. I will not undertake to dictate, but I wish for your own sake, that of your family, and of the preservation of your fortune, you would think seriously of conforming to the law of the country in which you are obliged to live. Tench did commend his father for showing his opposition, as he put it, not by acting, but by speaking your sentiments moderately and in such a manner that even those of a different opinion have not blamed you. Tench also stated in multiple letters that he wanted James to take the oath supporting the new government, but James never did. In a February 78 letter from Tench to his father, he noted regarding Phil, his act was a boyish trick. but thank God he has chosen a servant that will never throw him in my way as an enemy. In a letter to Richard, James detailed Phil's fate after a shipwreck in November 78. Phil was cast away in the Somerset man-of-war in November last upon Cape Cod and saved nothing but his life. 21 men lost their lives in that shipwreck caused by a storm, and remains of the Somerset are still in Cape Cod sand today. Tench wrote to his father, "The moment I heard that Phil was on board the Somerset when she stranded, I wrote to him and desired him to write to you and to me and to inform me whether he wanted any assistance in money matters." Tench was looking out for his little brother, despite the fact that he was with the enemy. In a 78 letter from Calcutta, Richard noted that he stood high in the opinions of the judges. When he closed, he wrote, "Pray remember me to all the family. Be assured that home is very frequently the subject of my thoughts, and that my greatest pleasures, like those of a person under a temporary banishment, arise from the hope that I shall at last return and be happy with my friends in my native country." It is interesting that Richard likened his situation to that of someone under temporary banishment. That certainly fit, since he fled America due to the war. In a letter from James to Richard in May 79, James alluded to their seeing eye to eye on politics and mentioned a visit from Tench. Note his lack of description of Tench's occupation. Little could be said considering mail could be read by others. "I dare not write of public affairs, else I could send you a volume which would contain some things that would make you laugh, others at which you'd swear. I must therefore confine myself to domestics. We have all been in Maryland a good while, except Tench remains where he was when I last wrote. And Phil, who went off to Lord Howe in a rage at hearing I was taken up at Philadelphia. Tench is at present with us here upon his first visit since he left us, and is full of health and spirits. His service with Washington was serving him well, apparently." In a November 79 letter to a friend, James wrote, "I have had but one short letter from Dick since his arrival in Bengal." Richard had arrived there in November 77, so for the 2 years since, James had only received one of the letters Richard had written. And he did hear about Richard from mutual friends in England, but imagine sending a letter and not getting a response for 2 years. In the summer of 1781, William, who had considered going to India as well, wanted Tench to help provide him safe passage to England to study law. Tench was afraid William would be looked upon with suspicion if he left the colonies at the wrong time. Tench had other concerns outlined in the letter. "It gives me pain to tell you that I cannot, without subjecting myself to censure, interfere in the least in procuring your recommendations to go to England. I am placed in as delicate a situation as it is possible for man to be. I am, from my station, master of the most valuable secrets of the cabinet and field, and it might give cause of umbrage and suspicion were I, at this critical moment, to interest myself in procuring the passage of a brother to England. Though I may know his intentions are perfectly innocent, others may not or will not." Tench then alluded to suspicions he faced. "You cannot conceive how many attempts have been made, some time ago, to alarm the General, Washington's, suspicions as to my being near his person. Thank God he has been too generous to listen to them, and the many proofs I have given of my attachment have silenced every malignant whisper of the kind." Tench had to put down rumors of those who questioned his loyalty to Washington because of his loyalist family members. In the end, William did well for himself. He would go on to overcome his loyalist past and serve as Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court from 1806 until his death in 1827. As noted earlier, Washington showed his appreciation for and trust in Tench by selecting him to carry the news of Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown to Congress in Philadelphia. Historian author Lefkowitz wrote, "This was probably the greatest honor that Washington granted to any of his aides during the war. He was one of Washington's principal aides de camp, and he was probably the general's best all-around wartime assistant." Tench left his aide-de-camp duties in December 1782 and returned to his pre-war merchant business in Baltimore. Richard wrote to his father in November of 81, mentioned receiving a letter from Tench, and wrote, "We are strangely dispersed, but I have confident hopes that we shall all meet again and be happy. His sister Mary had a similar thought in a letter not long after. If kind heaven ever permits us to be replaced in our former situation, how much happier shall I be than ever I was before? Why was I not more sensible of my happiness before this evil war squandered us over the face of the earth? The war truly had scattered Tillman's siblings across the globe, with Richard in India and Phil had seen Royal Navy service in Gibraltar and in the English Channel. In June 1783, James was distraught over the unhappy and ill-conducted dispute which has separated us from Great Britain. He wrote to a friend, "I love my country and my friends, and therefore look back upon the transactions of these last 7 years with an indignant concern." James wrote to Richard a few months later, "America has exchanged her happiness for her independence." He later told Phil, "I could yet have held my office of the Secretary of the Land Office under the new government, could I have reconciled it to my honor and my conscience." But he could not. He never did join the new government. James expected Richard to return to Maryland after the war. He wrote shortly before the Treaty of Paris, "Should a peace or even a truce take place, we shall expect you soon after." In a letter about that same time, William analyzed Richard's circumstances. "Your distance from the scene of contest to save you from the enmity of both parties, and I hope and believe that your friends on either side will receive you with a cordial welcome." William also expressed hope that Phil would escape hard feelings in the former colonies. As Phil went off very young, he wrote, and has done but little in America, there is no reason to think that after some time he may safely return to his friends. Richard's sister Mary wrote to him a month after the Treaty of Paris, joyous that communication would be much easier and that she would not have to be concerned about others reading her letters. She was relieved to hear that an eye condition he had was improving, and hoped he did not have to return to India in what she called that horrid climate. She wrote, "You know not how miserable I often was while you were in India. We were sometimes so long without hearing from you that I could not help fancying your silence was occasioned by everything that was dreadful." Mary wanted to see him after what she called a long 7 years' absence. Richard was not in combat, but his family still feared for his life because of India's notorious climate. It was not just families of individuals in the military that suffered from absence and worry, but those who fled the country to avoid the war. Mary displayed a sisterly smart mouth as well, in this letter and others. I love her letters. She says in this one, "By the way, why did you send us that vile picture? It was a proof that you knew nothing of your own face, for it does not bear the most distant resemblance to you. Nature has given you a good smart pair of eyes, but Mr. Saunders has given you one that is only fit for the head of a dead calf." Though Mary mocked the portrait, she surely treasured it as a reminder of her beloved brother. Phil wrote to Richard in 1783, "Between you and I, the colonel as you call Tench, he has finished his career gloriously. I hope he has quitted that diabolical service." Harsh words were incredibly rare in Tillman letters, and knowing Phil's sense of humor, as I do by now, I believe he meant diabolical service in jest. Yet, one can imagine Phil's thoughts at Tench's remaining with Washington, even after their father was arrested for being a loyalist. Tench never stopped looking out for Phil. Tench wrote in a November 1783 letter to Richard, who was then back in England and near Phil, "Make me affectionately remembered to him. If he remains in Europe, I may be of service to him in the commercial employ. He will probably go into that during the peace." The Treaty of Paris was only 2 months old, and Tench already had his hand outstretched, if he'd ever even retracted it. Phil wrote to Tench in March 1784, catching up after years of difficult communication. "I should long before this have wrote you, had I known where you were to be found. I am happy at last to hear that you have beat your sword into a plowshare and retired. You have got well and happily married. I am glad of it, and with all my soul. Believe me, Colonel, it was a gallant act. You concluded the war like a true soldier." Phil then reminisced. "You were always, when I was a youngster, kinder to me than any of the family, and I remember I was particularly attached to you. By the by, many a scrape you have got me out of in those days." Phil then reflected on their future. "I hope, though it is more than probable we shall not meet again, we shall ever be on terms of friendship." 23-year-old Phil did not want hard feelings over the war with his 40-year-old brother. Phil's correspondence picked up as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. In November of 1783, Tench wrote Richard a long letter. There was much for these close brothers to catch up on after years of intermittent communication. How happy am I, my dearest brother, in once more finding an opportunity of corresponding with you with that freedom from reserve, which can only make correspondence valuable. What a variety of scenes have we both experienced since we parted. You have been reaping the golden harvest of the East, while I have been toiling in the arid fields of the North. Tench expressed his desire to see Richard. He mentioned that people on this side of the water, whose resentments have not yet cooled, and there is no reasoning with the mass of people sore from their losses. Passions had not yet abated from the war. Of their father and friends, Tench wrote, "My father has often informed you of his fine state of health, which is really surprising considering that the late times vexed and perplexed him much. I will not undertake to say anything particular of your old acquaintances. The times put all things out of joint. Some are up and some are down. Some behave well and some ill. But have charity to believe that they all did what they thought right. They who took what I call the wrong road have paid dearly for it." Tench closed, noting, "My paper hints to me that I have only room to wish more anxiously to hear from you." Richard responded with equal affection. "Your letter gives me the greatest pleasure. We have, as you observe, gone through a variety of scenes since we parted, but our minds and hearts are still the same that they were 8 years ago. I feel that I am not altered, and your plain, manly, affectionate letter convinces me that you have undergone no change. What satisfaction have I in thinking that, after so long a separation, our meeting will be attended with the utmost freedom and familiarity." He congratulated Tench on his marriage, and then encouraged him in Latin to increase and multiply. Richard then assured Tench of his support for his home area. "You must not think me disaffected. I assure you I am as zealous a friend to our new government as you can be. The state of Maryland has my warmest wishes for its prosperity." Richard had played it safe during the war by leaving the country, and now he could genuinely be open to the new government. He joked about joining Tench in his merchant business, "provided you will take all the trouble and give me a profit of 30 or 40% or some such trifle." He finished by saying, "Pray let me hear from you as often as you can." Tench responded, "You can hardly conceive the pleasure I felt upon the receipt of your letter. It was next to that of really meeting you again, of which I do not despair." On Richard's wanting him to have children, Tench wrote that his wife desires me to let you know that she has punctually obeyed the motto by presenting me 2 weeks ago with a fine cherry-cheeked little girl. In a June 1785 letter to Tench, Phil noted that he was aide-de-camp to British Admiral Mark Milbank on the Sampson. Both brothers had achieved the honor of serving as aide to a high-ranking officer. Phil noted that he had lived among the English for so long that he had become quite an Englishman, and did not know if he would ever return to America due to his profession. With that in mind, he assured Tench of his love for his family and came up with a scheme for Tench to sail over to visit him. "I don't see why you might not put your person on board one of your own traders some fine morning with a strong westerly wind which shall whip you into the English Channel. You shall stay here and eat and drink till you're tired, and then we'll go to London and do your business, and you may be back in the Chesapeake before you know where you are. There is a plan for you. How rejoiced should I be to see it realized." Phil missed his oldest brother, whom he had not seen for 8 or 9 years. Phil then questioned Tench on whether he missed the military. "Have you absolutely bid farewell to a military life? Don't you sometimes catch yourself sighing after the plumed troops and neighing steeds?" "I should suspect so." They had a bond of military service, albeit on different sides. In November 1785, James wrote to Phil, usually in debt, of money offered by Tench from what he had received from Congress for delivering the news of the surrender of Cornwallis. James wrote, "Now if you have any scruples about accepting this money as smelling of rebellion, you may give it to the poor of the parish." And unfortunately, there is no indication in later letters of what Phil did with that money. In a postscript to that same letter, James mentioned that he realized when he thought Phil had been joking about marrying an older lady, he was actually pretty serious. James would have none of it. He wrote, "I shall be excessively sorry to find you capable of so vile a prostitution. I shall be very indifferent whether I ever hear more from you or of you, hoping, however, that she may bilk you by putting the money out of your reach and then living to an age of 100. What sort of friends have you who can advise you to so mean a step, and so contrary to every sentiment of virtue or honor?" It is interesting to think that James never threatened to disown Tench, who aligned so thoroughly with the Patriot cause. The difference is, James believed Tench's actions were honorable, though he disagreed with him. Phil, on the other hand, was not acting with what James described as virtue or honor, critical character traits in that era. The drama with Phil continued. A letter from a family friend in England in February 1786 revealed that Phil, at this time 25, had eloped with a 20-year-old daughter of the British admiral that Phil was aide to. Her name was Harriet. The admiral was concerned about the connection his daughter had made, and to put it mildly, James was not pleased with Phil's elopement. Some of his harsh language included unjustifiable step, most gratefully injurious, and rash and impudent. Also, if you should make a bad husband or even an indifferent one, you will be, I can tell you, the first of your name in that odious predicament, and I will absolutely renounce you. So look to it. Again, family honor was important. 1786 would not get any better for James. On April 18, Tench died at the age of 41 of malaria or hepatitis, which he probably picked up during his service. He left behind a wife, Anna Maria, a 2-year-old daughter, and an unborn daughter, later given the middle name Tench. Anna Maria lived to 87 and never remarried. The youngest of Tench's siblings, aged 20, wrote to his brother William. After describing Tench's last hours, their father not arriving in time to say goodbye, he wrote, "I have only to add that we wear full mourning." The family was in full mourning for its only patriot son and brother. James's grief permeated his letters. He wrote on April 21, "I had yesterday the saddest duty to perform I ever can know, that of following my dear Tench to his grave." He wrote to Richard a week after Tench's passing. James knew Richard was returning to England from India, but he did not know that 39-year-old Richard would never read that letter. He had died of a fever several days after setting sail from India. James and the family would not find out until about September. Nevertheless, James's letter was that of a heartbroken father to a son he knew would be likewise devastated. "Tench is gone, and I am left to lament as dutiful and affectionate a son as ever man had. He has left a little prattling girl, and his widow is supposed to be with child. It pains me to give you this melancholy intelligence, which I know will greatly affect you." Clearly, James held no grudges, even in death, against Tench for his patriot stance in the war. Washington wrote to James, "I may venture to assert that, excepting those of his nearest relatives, none could have felt his death with more regret than I did, because no one entertained a higher opinion of his worth or had imbibed sentiments of greater friendship for him than I had done." Washington went on to indicate that James had lost not just a son, but a friend. In May 1786, James wrote a letter to British Admiral Milbank, his son Phil's new father-in-law, and this is a letter that he never sent, but it's very ironic. The letter was meant to assuage any concerns that Milbank might have about the Tillman's social standing. James discussed his ancestry and his immediate family. One would think he would skirt the fact that his eldest sister with Washington. When I read that long letter for the first time, I assumed he would skip that fact, and he did not. And that's powerful to consider. James wrote, "All my children are living, but my eldest son, who died about a month ago, to the great regret of his family and friends, by whom he was most affectionately beloved and esteemed. He differed from me in judgment at the commencement of the troubles of America, and went into the American army. I knew the goodness and honesty of his heart, and that he acted from principle and was forced to lament a step I could not censure. He was aide and confidential friend to General Washington through the course of the war. Be so good, sir, as to excuse my dwelling a little upon the character of a man who's so near to my heart. In James's eyes, that rebel was a man of honor, and the loss was fresh. As I hinted earlier, 1786 only got worse for the Tillmans. Early that fall, the family learned that Richard had died in January of an illness while on a ship headed from India to England. James wrote, "It would seem as if affliction had made me its mark. Few men have had the misfortune of losing in short time 2 sons of so much merit." He described the news to Phil as "like daggers to my heart." Phil got out of the Navy soon after his elopement. Though details are vague, one can assume why. He and Harriet settled in Maryland. To make a long, intriguing story short, 10 months after Phil's death in 1797 at the age of 36, also due to illness, Harriet returned to England with their 5 children aged 10 and under. Her father deliberately did not see her for 4 months, and it took him even longer to see his grandchildren. Her hurt and frustration bleed from her letters with an eloquent grief. I have more letters from Harriet to read when I start working on my book, and hopefully those will reveal exactly why he kept his distance. But it is very likely that he was holding a grudge over her elopement with the colonist who once had been his trusted aide. As you have learned tonight from the Tillman family and even the Moultrie and the Milbanks, the Revolutionary War brought about, for various reasons, disagreements between fathers and sons, siblings, and fathers and daughters. Tench and his family may have disagreed on politics, but Tench still provided support for his family in certain affairs and let his father know he was safe after battles. Their family bonds and love remained strong. Historian Judith Van Buskirk wrote, "Ties of family and friends often prove more important to Americans caught in the coils of revolution than did military or political differences. Often, but not always." A quick example of a family disagreement that ruined relationships, in addition to the more well-known case of Benjamin Franklin and his son William, is the Moultrie brothers of South Carolina. Continental Army Major General William Moultrie had multiple brothers. One of them, John, was Royal Lieutenant Governor of East Florida. In an August 76 campaign to take St. Augustine, the capital of East Florida, then Colonel William Moultrie had no problem potentially taking the city where his brother governed. The campaign was cut short because the Continental Army was needed up north. In 1778, William participated in another campaign to take St. Augustine, and again, the campaign was cut short, but again, William had no problem potentially taking his brother's city. Another one of their brothers, Thomas, died defending Charleston, South Carolina from the British in April 1780. John wrote to brother Alexander. He began by lamenting what the war had done to brotherly relationships. "You are my brother, although that name formerly involved solid consolation and joy, has to me for 5 long years been a term of real sorrow. How happy and sad must that man be who dares not ask a blessing on the most public and interesting endeavors of his brothers, but on the contrary, pray to the Almighty to confound their devices." John then wished for the end of the war. He wrote, "But I hope, as this is the 5th year, it is the 5th and last act of the most dismal and bloody tragedy I ever saw." John had had enough of this war that damaged their relationships. As he continued in the letter, he grieved the death of Thomas, but he could find no consolation because he did not believe his death was honorable. Additionally, John felt Thomas had been forced to the Patriots' side. He wrote, "I know that he went into the rebellion against his principle and will. I talked with him, you know, just before he joined." John noted that Thomas wrote to him about his decision. "I have his letter after accepting his commission, excusing himself to me and declaring his only reason for joining was that he could not withstand the importunity or persistence of his friends, and that he might be no more teased and have a little quiet." John wished that Thomas had shown his usual resolution and steadiness, but instead, John wrote, he was seduced, he erred, he fell. On a somewhat more pleasant note, John noted that his parents had been spared the heartbreak of the divisive war. Heaven thought proper to take them away from scenes that might have wrung their hearts and sent them sorrowing to their graves. John closed with, "I hope this has found you in a disposition of mind consonant to mine, and that there will be an end of discord. No more striving of brother against brother, and that the only striving shall be who will be most zealous and active in restoring peace, prosperity, and happiness, and in bringing order out of confusion. Above his signature, he wrote, "I am your affectionate but distressed brother." After the war, John and his family moved to England. No evidence exists that he and William ever reconciled. How could political tensions among colonists down to the family level, like the Tillmans and Moultries, be so little known among the general populace today? Contemporaries of the Revolutionary War wrote about it. Maryland signer of the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll, wrote to his father in October 76, "We are miserably divided, not only colony against colony, but in each colony there begins to appear such a spirit of disunion and discord that I am apprehensive, should we succeed against Great Britain, which I think very improbable, we shall be rent to pieces by civil war and factions." The blunt words of an outsider showed a truly dismal condition in America. Hessian Lieutenant Colonel August von Dinklage wrote, "It matters little whether the Americans win or lose. Presently this country is the scene of the most cruel events. Neighbors are on opposite sides, children are against their fathers. If the rebels should win, they will break their necks one by one. What misery the people have plunged themselves into." Though the general public today may not know the internal messiness of the revolution, scholarly histories, especially in the burgeoning field of loyalist studies, have touched upon the complexity and discord. Historian Maya Jasanoff noted in Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, although the portrayal of the revolution as a civil war has not deeply penetrated American popular consciousness, it's been widely described as such in historical works. Leslie Upton, who edited a volume entitled Revolutionary versus Loyalist, the First American Civil War, wrote, "The simple fact that the Declaration of Independence was attended by civil war is often forgotten, and the events of the Revolution are thereby robbed of much of their drama." So how and why did this whitewashing occur after the Revolution? Contemporaries of the war had reason to hide the divisiveness, to promote unity moving forward as a new nation. In 1789, South Carolina historian David Ramsey published The History of the American Revolution. Ramsey feared the young nation faced disunity on political, economic, social, and cultural fronts, and used his history to attempt to thwart those threats. Ramsey focused on Republican ideals and spent little time on factions. In 2013, Michael McDonald wrote in his edited work, Remembering the Revolution, that Ramsey was one of the earliest to remember the war as the key to forging national unity. Mercy Otis Warren of Massachusetts began her History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution during the war, but did not publish it until 1805. She called the war a civil war, but did not highlight the extreme disunity. Warren saw the revolution as a victory for the Republican form of government that had to be maintained and protected in the new America. Her history, rallying citizens around a glorious past, could dispel threats to that new government. Warren and Ramsey focused on harmony for the sake of the new nation. Michael Kamen wrote in his 1978 book, A Season of Youth, The American Revolution and Historical Imagination, that between 1783 and about 1820, the young republic underwent an anxious quest for cultural cohesion that was aided by contemporaries of the war dying and the new nation and its incoming immigrants needing an event to look to that would unify them. A divisive revolution would not do. So authors, artists, speakers, and historians glorified battles and heroes and promoted a revolution that gave birth to the United States. Tench Chillman's 1786 obituary noted his service with Washington in the course of a glorious contest for freedom and independence. According to Sarah Purcell in her 2002 book, Sealed with Blood, War, Sacrifice, and Memory in Revolutionary America, not just publications, but also commemorations in the decades after the war were, quote, designed to downplay the bloodshed and division of war in order to bring disparate Americans together around images of shared sacrifice. The messages and themes of sermons, parades, monuments, and music were bound up in the process of nation building. The effects of that distortion have lasted. Historian McDonald wrote, Americans today most often recall tales of a revolutionary war that privilege unity over division and simple stories of the triumph of good over evil. He went on to discuss how textbooks focused on the war, sometimes sentimentally, as a nation-building event, overlooking that the war was long, 8 years, and bloody, enormous number of casualties in relation to population. Why was the war so awful? MacDonald wrote, the revolution went on so long because of the many divisions among colonists themselves over whether to fight, what to fight for, and who would do the fighting. The War for Independence was by any measure the first American Civil War. In conclusion, and as you perhaps think about what you know of the Revolutionary War, starting with the revolutionary generation, their war has largely been portrayed, remembered, through red, white, and blue colored glasses. Contemporaries meant well by focusing on unity to strengthen the nation, but the trials faced by divided families, towns, cities, and communities deserve our attention and understanding. The internal contentions of the war have been purged from popular memory, and my research helps us further understand the Revolutionary era. Frustrations with political choices of family members and the strains on relationships are part of the story and give us a new awareness and appreciation of that generation. I will close with an anecdote from the Tillmans. In June 1785, when his daughter was 8 months old, Tench wrote to Richard, "It is too early yet to make her know there is such a person as you in the world. At a proper season you shall be introduced to her acquaintance." If there is any indication Tench respected and loved his brother, despite his decision to leave America in her time of need, it was Tench's eagerness to tell the next generation of Richard. Thank you.
All right, nope, there's still an echo. That's okay. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to read some questions, and Jessica will take a few moments to answer them. So if you have any, keep typing them in. So Jessica, are the Tillmans related to the famous family of the same name on Maryland's Eastern Shore? If sure, was there any communication among them during the Revolution?
Okay. In the interest of time for my talk, I didn't really spend much time on James's brother Matthew, who I mentioned was a delegate to the Continental Congress and what came to be known as the father of the Revolution in Maryland. So I'm not sure who you mean by the famous Tillmans, because there are a lot of them. And I've met some descendants, and I've spent time seeing houses and homes and properties on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So they are definitely an Eastern Shore Maryland family, long established. Tench and James and the siblings were descended from a Richard Tillman who came over, I believe in the mid 1600s. I mean, Tench was like 4th generation on Maryland's Eastern Shore. So established, well-known, well-regarded family. Hopefully that answers the question. But Matthew Tillman obviously made a name for himself as a delegate to Continental Congress, and William, the brother who was Chief Justice of Pennsylvania Supreme Court, did pretty well for himself. And as a side note, it makes you wonder if some of these brothers like Tench and Richard had lived longer, what they could have accomplished if they went into public service. The question was, when will the book be published? Love it. So I really need a brain break. I defended my dissertation in December, had some revisions, and graduated in May. I'm really excited for when that moment comes that I am ready to just throw myself back into the research and work on that book. I love writing. I was a writing minor in college. I'm a bookworm. I loved writing stories when I was a kid. And there are some parts of the Tillman story I had to leave out in order to just finish and get the dissertation done. I'll just throw a couple things out there as teasers, so maybe you'll remember to buy the book. Tench was the first cousin to Peggy Shippen Arnold, who was Benedict Arnold's wife. Their mothers were sisters. I've seen in secondary sources that Benedetto might have used his connection to Tench when he was trying to get West Point, command of West Point. I couldn't find anything quickly to confirm that, so I kind of left that go for the dissertation. I want to look into William Tillman's story. He's the brother who went on to be Chief Justice in PA. He has maybe like 12 linear feet or something of papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. When I researched there, I just focused on the Revolutionary era of his papers, but I would love to dive in and see what kind of letters, what kind of grief he got for being a loyalist, trying to advance himself in the public field. And then, like I mentioned, Harriet, she wrote a lot back to the Chillmans in Maryland after she went back to England. She was close to them. There were so many letters, and I just had to kind of skim some of them to get a gist for what happened. And but there's a lot of things there that I can dive into. It'll take time to do more research to do it well, time to edit the book, time to go through the editing process with a publisher, finding the right publisher. I want to reach both the public and a scholarly audience, kind of blend those two fields. So I guess I didn't answer the question, but give me a few years, please, but I won't forget. Yes. The question was, is Fort Moultrie out into Charleston Harbor connected to William Moultrie? Yes. It actually was, it's named for William Moultrie, and I'm trying to remember the name of the island before it was named for Moultrie's heroics in defending that island from the British. I'm drawing a blank. But yes, there is a connection. Sure. All right, well, thank you all for attending tonight. Thank you for dealing with any technology issues or hiccups, but I enjoy sharing the Tillman story with people and getting it out there, and I just appreciate those who supported me through this whole process of going for the PhD and now cheering me on in the next step. So thank you so much and have a great evening.